In World War II, prisoners of war survived on 25 heartbreaking meals that were never meant to feed a human being. These weren't dinners, they were lifelines. Today, most people have no idea what they actually ate, how they stretched it, and what hunger forced the body to do just to stay alive. Most of these recipes were never written down, they were survived. Today, we're revealing the 25 hidden lifelines. Morning in a prisoners of war camp didn't begin with breakfast. It began with a cup, a dark, bitter liquid handed out like it was normal life, because the camp needed the routine to look orderly even when the body was falling apart. Men called it coffee, but it wasn't coffee the way you remember it. It was substitute brew, roasted grains, burnt scraps, hot water made to smell like comfort while delivering almost nothing. That's what makes it heartbreaking. In real life, breakfast is the first promise of the day. Fuel, warmth, a little strength before work. In captivity, this cup was a lesson in control. It told you the rules without speaking. You will stand, you will wait, you will work on emptiness. But the cup still mattered, not because it fed you, because heat can be a survival tool when food is missing. A warm drink stops shaking hands. It calms a stomach that's twisting from yesterday's hunger. It gives your throat something to swallow so the mind stops screaming for a minute. Some men drank it fast to quiet the pain. Others drank it slow, not for taste, just to stretch the feeling of having something as long as possible. And the ritual did something else. It separated the day into pieces. If you can divide time, you can survive time. Cup in the morning, roll call, work detail. Then, if you were lucky, the next thing that felt like a meal. That's the trap of starvation. It turns your life into countdowns. You don't think about next week. You think about noon. You don't plan dreams. You plan your stomach. So even this fake coffee had a purpose. It was the starting pistol. It pushed men out into the cold and into the line, and it forced their bodies to move before they were ready. It also created the first daily question that never stopped. When does the real food come, and what will it look like today? Midday was when the camp pretended to feed you, a line of men with tin cups, a ladle moving like a clock, and a pot that smelled like it might be food. Barley soup was often that pot. Sometimes it was truly barley. Sometimes it was barley by rumor, a few grains floating in hot water to make the bowl feel heavier than it really was. That bowl did two jobs at once. First, it gave volume. Starvation makes your stomach feel like a clenched fist, and warm liquid can temporarily open that fist. It spreads through the gut and tells your brain a comforting lie. You ate. Second, it gave heat. In damp weather and thin uniforms, heat is a nutrient. A hot bowl could stop teeth from chattering long enough to stand through the next count. But the real power of soup was routine. When you cannot control anything, a predictable meal becomes your calendar. Even on good days, the bowl was smaller than memory allowed. Men measured the day by the soup, and they judged the week by what the soup contained. Was it clearer than usual? Did the ladle scrape the bottom too soon? Were there any grains at all? Prisoners learned to read a pot the way a farmer reads clouds, because the pot was their weather. Barley, when it appeared, mattered because it clung to the body. A few grains can slow the sharp drop that follows pure hunger. Some men swallowed fast, afraid the stomach would notice how little it was. Others sipped slowly, not for flavor, but for time. If you stretched the bowl, you stretched the feeling of being alive, and still, it was never enough. The bowl ended, and hunger returned with a sharper edge, because now you knew what you were missing. That is the cruelty of thin soup. It wakes the appetite without satisfying it. So men began doing what survival always demands. They paired the bowl with whatever could be saved. They dipped crusts, softened hard bites, and tried to turn liquid into something that could last, because after the soup, the camp's real ruler arrived. Bread was policy. In many camps it arrived as a dark, dense slice, cut from a heavy loaf and issued like a ticket. You held it in your palm and felt its weight, then did the next calculation. Eat now or save it for later. That choice sounds ordinary until you understand camp hunger. Hunger doesn't only hurt, it negotiates. Eat the bread, and you get a few quiet minutes, a softer head, less shaking in the hands. Save the bread and you buy the future, but you pay with panic because your stomach will argue every step of the way. Men became planners, not because they wanted to, but because bread forced them to. The slice also became timekeeping. Some prisoners broke it into 4 pieces and assigned each piece a moment, after roll call, after work, before sleep, before dawn. Others hid half in a pocket seam, or wrapped it in cloth, protecting it from damp air, theft, and their own impatience. A man who could save bread had discipline. A man who could not save it was not weak, he was simply closer to the edge. Bread changed relationships too. It created hierarchies. The man with an extra bite could help a sick friend. The man with nothing watched every mouth with a new kind of attention. In huts where everyone was losing weight, even kindness had to be budgeted. And bread was never just bread. It was the base layer for every other meal. Dip it into soup, and it becomes softer, more swallowable, more filling. Spread it with a smear of fat, and it becomes fuel. Pair it with something sweet, it becomes memory. That is why bread was controlled so tightly. Control bread, and you control behavior. You control energy. You control hope. You can make men stand, march, work, and wait. So, when the next pot came around, prisoners watched for one thing first. What could the bread become today? Because the camp didn't feed you with variety. It fed you with repetition, often the same bitter soup, again and again, until the taste became part of captivity. If barley soup was the camp's illusion, turnip and potato soup was its reality. It came back so often that men could smell it before they saw it, a sharp, earthy steam that promised warmth but never comfort. The turnips were cheap and stubborn, easy to grow in hard ground. The potatoes, when they appeared, were the prize, small chunks that felt like coins dropped into the bowl. This soup taught prisoners the language of scarcity. When the ladle brought mostly turnip, you knew the camp was stretching. When a few potato pieces surfaced, you knew there was at least some starch left in the system. Men stared into their cups, the way gamblers stare at cards, trying to predict the afternoon from what floated on top. The taste was blunt. Turnip bitterness, watery broth, sometimes a hint of salt, sometimes none. But taste wasn't the point. The point was function. Hot liquid kept hands working. A little starch slowed collapse. A bowl at noon meant you might make it to evening. In some camps, that bowl was the day's center, the only thing to anticipate, and still, repetition had its own cruelty. The same soup again can wear down the mind. It turns days into copies, and copies into a fog. Some men began to dread the smell, not because it was disgusting, but because it was proof that nothing had changed. So they invented small upgrades. They dipped bread to soften hard edges. They saved crumbs from yesterday and stirred them in to thicken the broth. If they had a smear of fat from a Parcel day, they melted it into the cup and watched the surface shine like a miracle. If they had salt, they used a pinch like it was medicine. The most desperate trick was pacing. Eat too fast, and the hunger returns immediately. Eat too slow, and the cold steals the heat. Prisoners learned to balance swallow and warmth because both were survival. And when the soup pot held mostly cabbage, the smell changed, the air changed, and the huts filled with a different kind of captivity, one that lingered long after the bowl was empty. Cabbage stew was the kind of meal that didn't end when you finished eating. It stayed in the air. It clung to clothes. It seeped into the walls of the huts until the camp itself smelled like boiled leaves and damp wood. In a normal kitchen, cabbage can mean warmth. In a prisoners of war camp, cabbage meant volume without strength. hot liquid made to look like a meal. That's why it appeared so often. Cabbage is cheap, easy to chop, easy to stretch. A small amount can fill a large pot, and when you're feeding prisoners, full pot matters more than full bodies. The broth could be pale, sometimes greenish, sometimes nearly clear. The cabbage strips were soft, overcooked, and thin enough to disappear on the tongue. But even this had a survival use. Plant matter, even watery plant matter, gave the body something it could recognize. A little fiber, a little salt when there was any, a little warmth moving through the gut. Men who were sick could sometimes tolerate cabbage water better than dry bread. Men who were freezing could hold the cup with both hands and steal heat before they swallowed. The hardest part was the psychological effect. Hunger trains the mind to chase calories, and cabbage stew is mostly the opposite. Something you drink that leaves you emptier 5 minutes later. It tricks your stomach into waking up without satisfying it. And after months of that trick, the smell itself could trigger anger or despair. So prisoners adapted. They treated the bowl like a base layer, not a meal. If they had bread, they soaked it. If they had crumbs saved from yesterday, they stirred them in. If they had anything from a parcel day, fat, a pinch of sugar, a cube of flavor, they transformed cabbage water into something that felt closer to real food. And that transformation mattered because small upgrades kept men eating. When men stop eating, they stop fighting. Which is why the camp's next meal wasn't always a new dish. Sometimes it was the same soup with one difference, a few more grains, barley stretched carefully across a week like it was gold. If you think that was the worst part, it wasn't. The first meals were just the camp's routine. The real story is what prisoners learned to hunt inside the routine: barley, potatoes, anything with real calories, because in a prisoners of war camp, one extra bite didn't feel small. It felt like life. Now, here's the next meal. Barley wasn't served like a generous side. It was managed like a resource. In a camp system, grain was often the only thing that could turn hot water into something that sat in the stomach. That made it valuable, and anything valuable was controlled. When barley showed up, you could feel the change in the bowl. The broth looked thicker. The spoon scraped grains from the bottom. The cup felt heavier in the hand, and for prisoners that heaviness was more than comfort. It was a sign that the body might function a little longer. But barley also came with a cruel lesson. Scarcity can be organized. The kitchen didn't feed you barley, it allocated it. A small supply could be stretched across days, diluted and rediluted, until each serving held just enough to keep the illusion alive. Men learned this pattern quickly. Barley Day felt different. Non-barley day felt like a fall, so prisoners built their own strategies around it. Some saved bread to pair with barley because bread plus grain felt like a real meal. Some did the opposite, ate bread fast on empty days and tried to slow down on barley days. Some traded for extra barley when they could, not because it tasted good, but because it bought time. Barley did something else too. It gave the day a marker. Hunger makes time blur, and blur is dangerous. When you can't tell one day from the next, you lose your grip. A few grains in a cup were enough to create a memory. Today had barley. That memory helped the mind stay organized, but barley alone still didn't solve the real problem: energy. Grain helps, but the body craves dense calories, starch, and fat. That's why, when potatoes appeared, even in small amounts, men reacted like they had been handed something precious. A few grains in a cup were enough to create a memory. Today had barley. That memory helped the mind stay organized, but barley alone still didn't solve the real problem: energy. Grain helps, but the body craves dense calories, starch, and fat. That's why, when potatoes appeared, even in small amounts, men reacted like they had been handed something precious. A potato chunk in a prisoners of war cup wasn't a vegetable. It was a rescue. Potatoes are plain in normal life, but in starvation they become powerful because they are honest calories. They don't pretend. They actually feed. That's why prisoners watched the ladle so closely. When a pot had potatoes, the bowl could change the entire afternoon, not because it was enough, but because it slowed the crash. You could stand longer, walk steadier, think a little clearer, and in a camp, clearer thinking could keep you alive. Potatoes also changed how men ate. With thin soups, you can swallow without chewing and still feel empty. With potato, you chew. Chewing slows the meal down and signals the brain, this is food. Some men tried to chew slowly on purpose, stretching the moment the way they stretched everything else. Others ate quickly, afraid the hunger would become louder if they waited. And potatoes carried status in the bowl. If your cup had more pieces, you knew it. If your cup had none, you knew that too. Hunger makes people hyper-aware, not because they want to be, but because survival turns into constant measurement. So men built systems around potato days the way they built systems around barley days. Save bread for potato soup. Trade for a larger portion, if possible. Don't waste anything. Scrape the bottom of the cup. Use bread to gather the last bits. But potato supply wasn't stable. When potatoes vanished, camps leaned on other protein soups, often pea soup, sometimes thin, sometimes slightly thicker, always watched carefully because it could decide whether your legs kept working. Pea soup in a camp was never the thick, comforting kind you imagine from home. Most days it was watery, hot liquid with a faint, earthy smell and a few soft peas drifting like leftovers. But even watery pea soup mattered because it carried something the body desperately needed: protein. Protein is what slows the wasting. In long-term starvation, the body begins to consume itself. Muscle fades, strength collapses, legs shake. And once a man becomes too weak to stand in line, he becomes invisible. That's the harsh chain. So any protein, real protein, became valuable, even in a thin bowl. Pea soup also gave prisoners another survival tool: variation. Monotony drains morale. A small change in smell or texture can keep a man mentally present. Today is pea soup might not sound like hope, but in captivity it was a difference, and difference is a form of life. Men treated pea soup like a base for upgrades, the same way they treated cabbage water. If they had bread, they soaked it. If they had a tiny smear of fat, they melted it in and watched the surface turn glossy. If they had a pinch of salt, they used it like medicine. If they had anything sweet, they saved it, because sweet belonged to morale, not soup. And this is where the camp's real nutritional truth shows up. Soup kept you warm, bread kept you moving, but fat kept you functioning. That's why one of the most heartbreaking meals wasn't a bowl at all. It was a single spoon, a smear, a ration of margarine that could matter more than the whole pot. In starvation, fat stops being a flavor and becomes a weapon. A spoon of margarine could do what a whole bowl of watery soup could not. It could keep the body running longer. It burned slower. It warmed you from the inside. It softened bread so it didn't scrape your throat like punishment. And it delivered a blunt truth the camp tried to hide. Real energy still existed, but it was being measured out in crumbs. That's why a margarine portion felt so emotionally loud. It was small, but it changed your thinking. Men who received it didn't talk about taste first. They talked about relief. They talked about how their hands shook less, how their stomach stopped clawing for a little while, how they could stand through roll call without feeling like their knees were made of paper. And because it mattered so much, it became controlled, guarded, and traded. A smear of fat could be a personal decision: spread it now for immediate strength, or save it and use it later to make bread edible when the cold hit hardest. Prisoners learned to treat fat like currency, because it was. It could be swapped for an extra bite of bread, a better place in a line, a favor from someone with access to a kitchen pot. In a hunger economy, anything dense becomes power. Margarine also changed the soup. A tiny drop in a cup could transform hot water into something that felt like food. You could watch it melt and spread a glossy layer across the surface, and that shine meant survival. The same cabbage water that felt like surrender could suddenly feel like it had a purpose. But here's the cruel part. When the portion was gone, the body noticed immediately. Fat satisfaction fades into hunger again, and the return can feel even sharper because your mouth remembers what it's missing. That's why camps sometimes used sweetness as a different kind of control. Not to feed you, just to keep you moving. A small smear of jam didn't build strength the way fat did, but it could hold the mind together when everything else was falling apart. Jam in a prisoners of war camp was never about breakfast. It was about psychology. A thin smear of sweetness on bread could change the mood in a hut for a few minutes because it reminded men of normal life, kitchens, mornings, families, a world where food wasn't a punishment. That memory mattered. Hunger attacks the mind as much as the body. It makes time feel endless and makes tomorrow feel uncertain. Sweetness interrupts that darkness. It gives a quick reward, a moment of pleasure strong enough to pull a man through the next hour. But it was also a trick because sweetness fades fast. Sugar hits and disappears. The stomach feels emptier afterward, and the mind becomes more aware of how little is left. That's why prisoners learned to use jam strategically. Some ate it immediately to calm the panic. Others saved it for the worst moments, after a hard work detail, after a beating, after a night of shivering when sleep wouldn't come. Jam also became a trade item. Not everyone valued it the same way. A man desperate for fat might trade jam for margarine. A man desperate for a cigarette might trade jam for a smoke. And this is how a camp economy takes shape. Food becomes language. You don't barter for luxury. You barter for survival math. Even the act of spreading jam became a ritual. Some men used a finger to scrape every bit because waste was unbearable. Some used crumbs to soak the last sweetness, turning the smallest pieces into something worth swallowing. And when the sweet moments passed, the camp returned to what it could always afford: hot liquid, tea, substitute brews, warm cups that did not nourish but steadied the body enough to keep moving. That's why the next meal wasn't a dish at all. It was a cup of mint tea, served as if warmth could replace food. Up to now, you've seen the first layer of camp survival: thin soup, controlled bread, and tiny upgrades like fat and jam that could change a whole day. But the next meals weren't really meals at all. They were warm cups and small rituals that kept the stomach calm, the mind steady, and the body moving when calories were almost gone. And those little things mattered more than you think. Now, here's what came next. Mint tea sounds gentle until you imagine drinking it while starving. In the camp, it wasn't a comfort beverage. It was a tool. Warm liquid helped with nausea, cramps, and the constant twisting pain caused by thin soup and dry bread. When the stomach is empty for too long, it becomes unpredictable. Some men couldn't keep food down. Some felt constant acid. A warm cup could quiet the worst of it, and that's what makes mint tea so important in this story. It didn't solve hunger, but it kept hunger from becoming sickness. In a prisoners of war camp, sickness was a trapdoor. Once a man's stomach failed, once he started vomiting, once cramps kept him from eating, his strength dropped faster than everyone else's. Mint tea was a small way to keep the body cooperating, not thriving, cooperating. Tea also gave structure to the day. A camp strips away control, and control is what the human mind needs to stay stable. A cup in the morning, a cup in the evening, those small routines divided time into pieces. If you can divide time, you can survive time. A cup meant you made it to this point. A cup meant the day moved forward. Even when the food didn't, men held the cup with both hands, not to feel fancy, but to steal heat. In freezing huts, a warm cup was one of the few things you could press against your palms and feel alive. Some sipped slowly for the same reason they ate slowly: stretching the moment. Others drank quickly, trying to force warmth into their body like medicine. A few saved the last mouthful for later, not because it had nutrition, but because it had a calming effect, like giving the stomach a reason to stay quiet. And because hunger creates sharp instincts, men learned to read the cup. If the tea was warmer than usual, you noticed. If it was weaker, you noticed. If it disappeared for a day, you felt the danger immediately, because without warm liquid, bread became harder to swallow, soup became harder to tolerate, and the whole survival system became more brittle. But tea also had a darker role. It could make the camp appear orderly. It gave guards the illusion of care without the cost of calories. It kept prisoners standing, which kept the machine running. A man who can stand can be counted. A man who can be counted can be worked. And once you've lived on hot tea and thin soup, you begin to understand the camp's world of substitutes. Substitute food, substitute comfort, substitute normal. That leads directly into the next drink. Roasted grain coffee, the ritual that looked like the old world but arrived empty. This coffee was not coffee. It was a smell built to imitate comfort. Roasted grains, burnt substitutes, hot water made dark enough to pass as the real thing from a distance. It was served because it cost little and achieved something important. It created routine, and that routine wasn't a small thing. In a camp, routine is control, and control is survival. The cup showed up at the same time, in the same way, with the same bitter heat. It trained men to stand, to move, to obey the clock even when their bodies were empty. The camp could claim it was providing while spending almost nothing. A warm cup is cheap. Hope is expensive. Routine is what hunger tries to steal first. When you're starving, the day becomes chaos inside your head. You think about food constantly. You lose track of time. You drift. A cup placed in your hands brings you back to the present. It tells your mind, this is morning, even if your body is empty. It gives you something to do besides shake. Something to hold besides air, and sometimes holding something, anything, helps you feel human for a minute. For some prisoners, the cup carried memories. Coffee at home, quiet kitchens, a moment before work. That memory could lift a man for a minute. For others, it did the opposite. It made the loss feel sharper. The smell was too familiar, and familiarity can hurt when you're trapped. The cup could feel like a cruel imitation. The camp, borrowing the shape of normal life while denying everything normal life contains. Still, the cup was useful. Warm liquid kept blood moving in the cold. It calmed the stomach. It made the throat swallow. And in a camp, swallowing itself can become a victory, because sickness and weakness make eating difficult. Some men sipped slowly to stretch the warmth. Some drank fast to quiet the pain. Some saved a few mouthfuls for later. Not because it had nutrition, but because it had heat, and heat could keep your hands working. But the cup also exposed the truth. You could smell coffee, yet feel no strength. You could complete the ritual and still be empty. And after enough mornings like that, men began to crave something else, something solid, something that could be carried, saved, and used as a backup when soup was too thin or missing. That's why hard biscuits mattered. They were brutal on the teeth. But they had one advantage the camp meals rarely offered: reliability. Hard biscuits were not pleasant. They were dry, dense, and tough enough to punish your mouth. But in a prisoners of war camp, reliability beats pleasure. A hard biscuit could be saved. It could be hidden. It could be carried through a work detail or a cold night when soup didn't come. It didn't spoil quickly, and that meant it could become a private safety net. And that word, private, mattered. In a camp, most food was public. A line, a ladle, a portion you couldn't control. A biscuit was one of the few things a man could truly own for a moment. He could decide when to eat it, how to split it, whether to trade it, whether to protect it for the worst hour of the day. That small bit of control did something psychological. It reminded the mind that tomorrow still existed. Men learned techniques to make them edible. They soaked them in soup until they softened. They crumbled them into hot water to create a paste. They broke them into small pieces and sucked on them slowly to stretch the calories and keep the mouth busy. When you're starving, even the act of chewing can calm the mind. It gives you something to do besides listen to your stomach. It keeps panic from rising too high. It keeps you present. But biscuits had their own dangers. Teeth and gums weakened in captivity. Mouth sores were common. Dry food could crack lips, scrape the throat, and turn eating into pain. That's why men guarded warm liquid so carefully, because warm liquid turned a hard biscuit from a weapon into a meal. Some men waited until the soup came, no matter how hungry they were, just so the biscuit wouldn't destroy their mouth. Others crushed it into powder, saving a pinch at a time, building a slow, quiet meal that lasted longer than it should have. Biscuits also became trade goods. A man with biscuits could swap them for bread, for a smear of fat, for a pinch of sugar. Anything that shifted the survival math. In a place where the body is constantly losing, even tiny shifts matter. A biscuit could be a bribe, a peace offering, a rescue for a sick friend, or a way to buy help when you were too weak to carry something yourself. And when parcels entered camp life, biscuits often arrived alongside other items that were far more powerful than any single camp ration. Because parcels didn't just add food, they introduced variety, density, and control. They turned prisoners into planners again. They created economies. They created shared systems, and sometimes they created the first truly complete meals men had seen in months. The kind of meal that didn't just warm you, but actually rebuilt you. That's why the next item isn't a camp ration at all. It's the parcel mix. The box that could change the odds of survival. The math changer. When parcels entered a camp, the entire survival equation changed. Not because prisoners suddenly ate well, but because they finally had control again. Camp rations were designed to be predictable and thin. Parcels introduced density, variety, and planning. Three things starvation tries to erase. Biscuits were often the first parcel item that mattered because they were portable and shareable. A biscuit could be saved for a work detail. It could be split into 4 parts and scheduled across the day. It could be traded without cooking. And most importantly, it could back up the camp's worst days. Those days when soup was nearly clear and bread felt smaller than usual. But the real power of parcel extras wasn't one item. It was the combination. A biscuit with a smear of jam became morale. A biscuit with cheese became real fuel. A biscuit crumbled into hot liquid became a small porridge that the weak could swallow. Suddenly, men weren't just receiving food, they were engineering meals. That's why parcels created structure inside chaos. In some huts, prisoners pooled items and built fair systems. Today we open one parcel, tomorrow another, and everyone gets a share. In others, men created tiny personal stashes, because a stash meant tomorrow existed. Parcels also created a new kind of attention. Men stopped only watching the camp ladle. They started watching each other's decisions. Who shares, who hoards, who trades, who collapses. Hunger forces morality into the open, and that brings us to one of the most common parcel items that looks innocent on paper but becomes life-changing in a camp: powdered milk. Because when chewing becomes difficult, drinkable calories become the difference between decline and recovery. Powdered milk is easy to underestimate until you imagine months without protein, without steady calories, without anything that feels like rebuilding. In captivity, powdered milk became one of the quietest but most powerful survival tools because it could be turned into nourishment without needing teeth, strength, or a kitchen. Men mixed it into hot water and drank it slowly, letting the warmth hit first and the calories follow. They stirred it into thin soup to thicken the broth. They saved it for the sick, because sickness plus starvation is a fast downhill slope, and the sick often cannot chew dry bread without choking or vomiting. Milk became a way to feed a body that had stopped cooperating. It also brought back something hunger tries to delete: normal texture. Bread and watery soup are harsh. Milk changes mouthfeel. It makes swallowing less painful. It gives the brain a sensory signal that says, this is food, not just hot liquid. And powdered milk had a morale effect, too. It carried a faint taste of home. Not the exact taste, war substitutes rarely do, but enough to remind prisoners what a kitchen used to feel like. That memory could keep a man from mentally slipping into numbness. Strategically, milk was also easy to ration. A spoonful could be saved, a tin could be stretched across days. It taught the same survival habit again: slow down, portion, plan, endure. But once milk entered the picture, prisoners began noticing something else even more clearly: fat. Because milk helped, but fat could change energy levels in a way nothing else could. That's why the next meal isn't a full meal either. It's dense portions of cheese and butter that could rescue a body in a single afternoon. Up to this point, the story has been about staying functional on almost nothing: soup that lied, bread that controlled the day, and powdered milk that helped the weak keep something down. Now the menu shifts into the foods that truly changed survival odds: dense calories you could feel immediately, portions you could ration like currency, and bites that kept a body from wasting away overnight. Cheese and butter were small in size but massive in consequence. In a prisoners of war camp, dense calories are like a battery. You don't need a lot, you need enough. And a few bites of cheese or a small smear of butter could do what thin soup could never do: stop the body from burning itself as quickly. Men could feel the difference within an hour: less wobble in the legs, less shaking in the hands, a steadier head. Butter turned bread into actual fuel. It softened the bite, slowed digestion, and gave the body something to burn through cold hours. Cheese did something similar, but with protein added, helping muscles hold on when the body was trying to shrink you down to nothing. Even the mouth reacted differently. Real fat and protein made food feel complete, not just swallowed. These items also changed behavior. Men who had cheese didn't just eat, they planned. They'd save it for after-work detail when legs trembled and hands shook. They'd cut it into tiny portions to spread the benefit across multiple days. They'd trade a slice to help a sick friend, because helping someone survive could keep a hut stable, and stability mattered. One strong hut meant fewer men collapsing, fewer men getting singled out, and a better chance of enduring the next week. But dense food also attracted danger. Dense food becomes currency, and currency invites theft. In huts where everyone is starving, even decent men can become desperate men. That's why prisoners hid butter, wrapped it, buried it inside cloth bundles, protected it from heat, from rats, from eyes. Some hid it in seams, some under straw, some kept it close enough to feel like they were guarding their future. And the moment cheese and butter appear, they point toward the next step in survival logic. If fat and protein are this powerful, then the most powerful parcel item of all becomes obvious. Something sealed, stable, portable, nutrition you could count on even when the camp meals collapsed: tinned meat and fish. Because a tin wasn't just food, it was strength you could measure, share, stretch, and trade, one of the few things that felt like real nutrition in a world built on scarcity. A tin of meat or fish in captivity was more than a meal. It was a resource deposit. It could rebuild strength, and it could be converted into other forms of survival. That's why men treated tins carefully, almost ceremonially, because opening a tin meant deciding how much of your future you were willing to spend today. Some ate it straight, fast because the body demanded it. Others did the smarter thing. They stretched it, a few bites today, a few bites tomorrow, mixed into soup to make the broth finally feel like it had a purpose, crumbled into a shared pot so the entire hut could gain strength together. One tin could lift multiple men for a day, and in camps, one lifted day could be the difference between holding on and collapsing. Meat and fish also created the strongest trade value. A man without cigarettes might trade fish for tobacco. A man without bread might trade meat for an extra slice. A man desperate for warmth might trade protein for socks, thread, or a blanket patch. It sounds strange until you understand that cold kills hungry men. If you can trade food into warmth, you can survive longer. But meat tins also had emotional weight. They were proof that the outside world still existed, proof that real food still existed somewhere. That reminder could strengthen a man or break him, depending on his mental state. Hunger makes you sensitive, and a taste of normal life can hurt as much as it helps. Still, once tins entered camp life, the next thing that mattered came naturally: fast energy. Because when a body is starving, it craves immediate lift. Something that hits quick, something that feels like light. That's why sugar and chocolate became more than treats. They became emergency fuel for the mind and body. Sugar is immediate energy. Chocolate is sugar plus fat. In a camp, that combination was explosive, not in taste, but in effect. A bite of chocolate could raise a man's energy fast enough to stand straighter, think clearer, and endure another hour without feeling like he was fading out. For a moment, the world sharpened again. Less dizziness, less trembling, less fog in the head. That's why men didn't eat sweets casually. They used them strategically. Some saved sugar for the worst mornings, when the body felt weak before work detail. Some saved chocolate for the coldest nights, when morale was collapsing and hope felt like a word from another language. Others traded sweets because sweets held value across all types of prisoners. Everyone understands sugar. A small square could buy a favor, an extra crust, or simply goodwill in a hut where everyone was running on empty. Chocolate also had psychological power. It tasted like a different world. It reminded men of childhood, holidays, home kitchens, and that reminder could reset a mind that was drifting into numbness. Numbness is dangerous in captivity because numb men stop fighting. Even the smell mattered. Cocoa in the mouth could briefly silence the camp, replacing it with memory. But sweets came with a trap. The energy spike fades quickly, and the crash can feel brutal. That's why many men paired sugar with bread or fat, trying to soften the fall. If you could combine dense calories with fast calories, you could build a longer, steadier kind of endurance. Some learned to take tiny bites, spacing them out like rations for the brain, not just the body. This is where camp survival turns into chemistry. Men learned their bodies. They learned what made them shaky, what made them nauseous, what helped them last. They learned that the smallest additions could change a day. In a place designed to erase choice, even choosing when to eat one bite was a form of control, which is why the next item sounds tiny, but it mattered like medicine. Bouillon, concentrate, flavor packets, anything that turned hot water into something the body would accept. Bouillon and soup, concentrates, anything salty and flavorful, helped solve that, not by adding huge nutrition, but by making the thin camp meals tolerable. Salt stimulates appetite. Flavor signals food to the brain. A cube dissolved in hot water could become a drink that steadied nausea. A pinch mixed into watery soup could transform the entire cup from punishment into something manageable. It didn't change the size of the ration, but it changed the will to take it in. This is why prisoners treated flavor like medicine. They didn't waste it. They didn't sprinkle it casually. They rationed it in pinches, saving it for days when the soup was too clear, too bitter, too demoralizing to swallow. Some men hid cubes like treasure, breaking off slivers the way you'd break tablets. Small doses, timed carefully, never wasted. Concentrate also mattered for the sick. when a man couldn't chew bread, when his throat hurt, when fever made him weak, flavor in warm liquid could get him to ingest something. That's not comfort. That's survival practice. And when the weak could drink, the hut stayed stronger, because one collapse often triggered another. But once you have items like bouillon, sugar, meat, and cigarettes circulating, a camp stops being only a place of rations. It becomes a market. And in that market, meals aren't always served. Meals are negotiated. A pinch of flavor could be traded for a bite of bread, a favor, a quiet warning, because taste itself had value when everything else was stripped away. Which brings us to the final standard length item before the extended survival systems. At a certain point, the camp stopped being only guards and lines and ladles. It became an economy. And in that economy, the most important skill wasn't cooking. It was conversion, turning what you had into what you needed. Cigarettes became currency because they were small, divisible, widely desired, and consistently valuable. A non-smoker could trade cigarettes for food. A smoker could trade food for cigarettes. That exchange system created a market where meals weren't only what the camp issued, they were what you could negotiate. This market changed survival odds dramatically. A man who could trade intelligently might get an extra slice of bread on a day when his body was collapsing. A man who could trade for soap might avoid infection. A man who could trade for thread might keep his clothing together and avoid losing heat. Every trade was survival math. But markets also created risk: theft, cheating, punishment, conflict. So prisoners built informal rules and networks. They chose trusted traders. They hid goods. They pooled items in huts to reduce inequality. They tried to keep the system stable because instability in a starving camp is a slow disaster. And here's the deepest truth about barter meals: they restored agency. Hunger steals your sense of choice. Barter returns a small piece of it. Even if you are trapped, you can still decide, I will trade this for that. I will live another day by making the right move. Now the story shifts into the extended survival systems, the meals that weren't just items but structures, the shared camp stew, smuggled extras, crumb strategies, march rations, and what happens when starvation finally ends. Up to now, you've seen the standard camp reality: thin rations, parcel boosts, and the barter economy that formed when hunger became a marketplace. Now we move into the survival systems that mattered even more than any single item: shared stew, smuggled extras, crumb strategies, and the routines prisoners built to keep a whole hut alive, not just one man. This is where the menu stops being food and becomes strategy. When prisoners pooled their food, it wasn't because they were trying to be noble. It was because pooling solved a problem that hunger creates immediately: unevenness. In a camp, unevenness becomes resentment. Resentment becomes theft. Theft becomes violence. And violence becomes punishment for everyone. So men built a system that turned a box of random items into a stable routine. In a camp, unevenness becomes resentment. Resentment becomes theft. Theft becomes violence, and violence becomes punishment for everyone. So men built a system that turned a box of random items into a stable routine: shared stew. A camp stew might start with whatever the camp issued: thin soup, cabbage water, a few grains. Then parcel items would be added like upgrades. A spoon of powdered milk thickened the broth. A crumble of biscuit turned liquid into something that sat heavier. A shaving of cheese added real fuel. A pinch of bouillon made it swallowable. A tiny slice of tinned meat, spread across 10 men, made the stew feel like the outside world existed again. This is where survival becomes engineering. Individual eating is emotional. Shared cooking is strategic. If one man opens a tin and eats it alone, he's stronger for a day, and then he's back to collapse. If 10 men share the tin across 10 cups, the hut stabilizes. 10 men become slightly less weak. 10 men can stand longer. 10 men are less likely to mentally break. Pooling also changed morale. A shared pot created fairness. Fairness reduces panic. Panic makes people rush and waste. When men trust the system, they can slow down. They can ration properly. They can plan tomorrow. In hunger, planning is oxygen. But pooling wasn't perfect. It required trust. And trust is hard when everyone is starving. Some huts had arguments. Some had hoarders. Some had men who tried to skim the best parts. That's why many groups developed rules: a designated cook, a watcher, an agreed distribution method. Nothing fancy, just enough structure to stop the pot from becoming chaos. And the pot did one more thing. It created a rhythm of hope. Tonight we'll cook. Tomorrow we'll share. That rhythm turned days into steps instead of fog. It didn't fix captivity, but it gave men a ladder inside it. Still, even with shared stew, many prisoners lived on the edge, which is why the next meals weren't served at all. They were stolen, smuggled, or quietly added, tiny extras that could rewrite a week. Not every survival meal came from a ladle or a parcel. Some came from opportunity, a work detail near a kitchen, a moment in a storage area, a peel dropped on the ground, a scrap left in a pot, a sympathetic hand. A trade done quietly, a bite taken fast and hidden under silence. This is the harsh math of captivity. When the official system doesn't feed you enough, survival shifts to margins. A single extra bite a day, one peel, one spoon, one crumb, can slow the decline. It doesn't sound like much, but starvation is a long process. Small advantages add up. Smuggled food was dangerous. If caught, a prisoner could be punished, lose rations, be beaten, or be placed in confinement. But hunger changes risk perception. When your body is fading, tomorrow is not guaranteed, so the risk of punishment can feel smaller than the risk of doing nothing. Men also learned the psychology of extras. You couldn't flaunt them. You couldn't eat them loudly. You had to hide the evidence because scarcity makes eyes sharp. A man who appears to have more becomes a target. So smuggled meals were eaten quickly, quietly, with heads down. And smuggled extras shaped relationships. Some men shared them, building loyalty. Some kept them secret, building safety. Some traded them, turning access into currency. A man who had kitchen access became valuable. His extra bite could be exchanged for bread, socks, thread, anything that kept him warmer and less exposed. But smuggling had a darker side, too. It could create inequality inside a hut, and inequality inside starvation can fracture a group. That's why pooling and fairness systems mattered. They weren't idealism. They were practical protection against collapse. And even when no extras were available, prisoners still built a private survival system that required no risk at all, just discipline, saving crumbs, saving crusts, saving the smallest pieces that most people in normal life would never notice. Restored a small amount of control in a world designed to take all control away. A man who saved crumbs could decide, I will eat later. I will hold something back. I will not let the day take everything from me. Men hid crumbs in pockets, in seams, wrapped in cloth, tucked under straw bedding. They did it because hunger makes time terrifying. If you know you have even one bite later, the day feels less endless. Panic drops, the mind steadies, and a steadier mind makes better decisions. Crumb saving also turned into micro-meals. A handful of crumbs could be soaked into tea and swallowed like porridge. It could be added to soup to thicken it. It could be pressed together with a smear of fat to create something that felt substantial. These weren't meals made for enjoyment. They were meals made for endurance. But crumb saving carried a constant threat: theft. In a crowded hut, food becomes the most watched object. Even decent men can become desperate men. So hiding crumbs became an art. Some men trusted a friend to guard a stash. Some stitched pockets inside clothing. Some slept with their food under them like it was a weapon. And there was an emotional cost, too. Saving crumbs is a form of living in fear. It trains the mind to think small, to think only about the next bite. But in captivity, thinking small is sometimes the only way to survive long enough to think big again. Then the war shifted, camps moved, and a new kind of food appeared. Food meant to be carried. March rations, portable calories issued in cold conditions, often too little, often too late. When prisoners were forced onto marches, the entire food system collapsed. No stable kitchen, no predictable pot, no hut routine, just cold air, exhaustion, and long distance. And a marching body needs more fuel, not less, because every step burns what little is left. March rations, when issued, were usually portable: a chunk of bread, a biscuit, maybe a smear of fat if you were lucky. Sometimes nothing but the hope that food would appear at the next stop. That uncertainty is what made march food terrifying. In camp, you could sometimes plan. On a march, planning becomes guessing. Men learned to eat differently on the move. If you ate everything early, you might collapse later. If you saved too much, you might collapse now. So prisoners made brutal choices: small bites spaced out, crumbs saved for the end of the day, a biscuit hidden as emergency fuel when legs began to fail. Cold made it worse. Cold increases calorie needs. Cold makes fat feel like gold. Cold makes fingers stiff, so even eating becomes difficult. Bread hardens, biscuits become harder, water freezes, and yet men still had to chew, swallow, and keep walking. March rations also changed the social environment. A man who stumbled became vulnerable. A man who collapsed might not get back up. So food on the march became a rescue tool. A bite shared with someone who was fading, a crust given to keep a friend moving, a piece traded for help carrying a burden. And then, when the march finally ended, when captivity finally broke, another danger appeared that most people don't expect: the first meals after starvation. Liberation is often imagined as a feast: a starving man finally free, finally fed, finally safe. But the body doesn't switch back to normal instantly. After long starvation, the body becomes fragile, organs slow, the digestive system adapts to scarcity, and sudden heavy eating can be dangerous. That's why the first meals after liberation often had to be careful: small portions, gradual rebuilding, simple foods that the body could accept. For survivors, those first bites carried more than calories. They carried shock. Some men ate slowly because they didn't trust it. Some ate fast because hunger had trained them to fear tomorrow. And that's the part most people never understand. These weren't meals the way we use the word today. They were decisions. Save the bread, trade the sugar, stretch the tin,